Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Today, we're going to be talking about Mark 5. I've titled this presentation, Faith Matters, because we're going to be talking about some matters of faith today and then how faith matters in our walk with Jesus. So we're going to start right out with the book of Mark. So first of all, where has Jesus been? You remember from chapter 4, he was crossing the Sea of Galilee with the disciples, runs into a big storm. The disciples wake him up and say, hey, have you noticed we're in trouble here? And he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So we see the disciples being very human, very fearful of what's about to happen to them. And we'll see the significance even today more about the sea. So Mark 1, chapter 1, they went across the lake to the region of Gerastus. And this area gets lots of different ways of being identified. They all start with G. And I guess I think of it as Gentile country. There are some Jewish settlements there, but not many. Almost all of this area is Gentile. Jesus has gone from the west to the east across the sea and has entered an area which is largely Gentile. And Greek, there are 10 cities there. It's called a Decapolis. It's a practice of the Greeks to copy their cities wherever they go. And so they have 10 cities there. We're also going to be looking at the term proleptic. And that means a foretaste of something fuller. We'll see that Jesus's ministry to the Gentiles is not yet in full commitment. And so it opens the door, cracks the door to the Gentiles today, but doesn't move to full commitment. We'll see about that when we move on. So the first thing that happens, Jesus comes ashore and he meets a demoniac. Mark 5, verses 2 through 5. This man has been living up in the hills. He is he's a crazy man. He's lives in the tombs. He yells out at night. He tries to cut himself with stones. He's very strong. He's been chained hand and foot, we're told, but he broke loose. So he strikes fear in the minds of the people, and he's possessed by an evil spirit, and he lives in the tomb. So he's been ostracized from society, and in fact strikes fear in people as they travel through there. So we're about to see Jesus' second exorcism. This is reminiscent of chapter 1. When I was with you last, we talked about this, a man in the synagogue, but this one is different. The first man came into the synagogue and the spirit recognized Jesus as God, but wanted to be left alone. He didn't want anything to do with Jesus. Okay, there. And this man, however, came at Jesus and fell at his feet, and the evil spirit actually prays. We've all heard, though, of course, that Satan recognizes God immediately, and the spirit does as well. And he says, hey, leave us alone. Don't drive us out of this man. And if you do, put us somewhere where we can have a bodily form. Perhaps they didn't want to be sent back to hell, off of the earth. And so they recognized Jesus' power and pleaded for mercy. They say, swear to God, they pray, swear to God that you won't torture us. Jesus wants a name. Giving your name is a way of giving up some power. If a police officer stops you and asks you for your name, you're immediately giving in to him and saying, here's my identity, and you can track that back as however you like. You can go on your computer there in the car, and you can find out who I am and my history. And Jesus said, tell me your name to the spirit. And they say, our name is Legion. This legion is a reference to a military term of a large number of soldiers. Again, this is a Gentile area, and so it's influenced by Roman government. And so using the word legion means we are a lot. And Jesus The spirits begged Jesus not to send them into that region and out of the area and out of this man. Send us among the pigs, they say, and allow us to go into them so we have some bodily farm. And Jesus said, okay. He sends them into the pigs, and the pigs go into the sea and drown. This man was well known, as we know. Matthew 8 recounts the story, but they mentioned two men. Matthew mentions two men. Mark concentrates on one, probably the worst of the two, but he tells the story using one man. This man, possessed with an evil spirit, came down from the tombs and had been very strong, chained hand and foot, but broke loose. He cried out at night and day and cut himself with stones. Mark 1. They went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes, and the first stop is in Gentile country, these 10 cities. And so they are now meeting this demoniac. So what is it about the sea? Jesus has just calmed the Sea of Galilee with the disciples in it. He now sends the demons into the pigs, which then drown in the sea. The Hebrews were saved when God parted the Red Sea. Jonah was on a ship threatened by a storm at sea. Paul was shipwrecked at sea. I think that was the Isle of Cyprus, maybe. And the sea is a symbol of danger and judgment. It becomes a dangerous place for people. And so when we talk about the sea, we often find that it relates to being out of control, as the disciples felt on the Sea of Galilee, and not being able to feel safe. So in Revelations 21:1, I thought this was an interesting verse. It says, and this is John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. So John's vision of the future and of the new heaven and new earth is that there won't be danger, there won't be threatening, there won't be the unknown. We won't have a sea which has threatens our lives and keeps us feeling unsafe. So what about these pig herders and the people who had these 2,000 pigs? I kind of feel sorry for them. Suddenly they're out doing their job, and the pig herders ran off and reported to the people in the town, the countryside, hey, you know that naked guy who lived up in the tombs and we're all kind of afraid of? Well, let me tell you what happened. And now all our pigs are drowned. So they raise a good deal of concern and interest in the part of the people. So more people head out to see Jesus, and what do you think they find? They saw the man who had been possessed by a legion of demons sitting there dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Now, why would they be afraid? I mean, they'd been afraid of this guy, and he's been yelling and screaming and threatening and haunting them in a sense, and now all of a sudden they see this huge change. Well, what made them afraid is what kind of power makes this happen? What makes this kind of change? If you've ever seen someone make a dramatic change in their lifestyle, somebody that's really cranky or really unhappy all the time suddenly changes, you wonder what's going on. And so do they. They want to know why this man Jesus has been able to affect such a dramatic change in someone they've become accustomed to running around naked. And so they begin to plead with Jesus, please leave the region. Please leave the region. So why do they want him to go away? They see the man as they fear dressed and calm. He's thankful. They see this strong person as overcome by something stronger, and they see the powerlessness they have in their presence of Jesus. They see the power of God, and that's kind of scary. It's scary for us too when we recognize and look at our earth and see the creation and all the things that God did with a word, and we need to come before him as his children. Jesus' ministry to the Gentile meets some resistance immediately. So he moves on until another time, and just kind of opens the door, and we'll learn some more about that soon. First of all, though, he gives a field promotion. You know, a field promotion is when somebody is in battle and maybe there's the loss of an officer above them, and they are promoted immediately to take charge. Jesus was getting in the boat, and a man who had dropped, who'd been demon possessed, said, "Hey, I want to go. I want to be with you. I want to be a disciple in a sense." And Jesus said no, he would not let him. He told him to go home to his family and to tell them of God's great mercy to him. Now, who are his family? He is a Gentile. He is to go to the Gentiles. Jesus wanted the word spread of God's love and care. A different pattern than we see before when Jesus is in Israel. He does a miracle of compassion with somebody and he says, "Keep this quiet. I don't need this spread all over the place." But not to the Gentiles. He wants us to hear. He wants people to have their hearts open to a word which is coming soon. So that proleptic idea is that the Gentiles are going to be full partners in this kingdom of God. The man did just that. He became an apostle to the Decapolis. He was an effective witness to many. And it says to us in verse 20 that all people were amazed. The people were amazed at this guy's witness. And it was simple. It was straightforward. He wasn't a theologian. He didn't know the history of the Jews. He didn't have all the training that they had gone through in the synagogues. He was simply healed. And he shared that with people. And I think that's pretty comforting. And Jesus tells us to go where you're planted. Do what you can do to let other people know what God has done for you, what God's great mercy has affected in your life. So at this point, no Gentile can fill the role of disciple. Salvation proceeds from the Jews, and Jesus is true to that. This man was promoted to apostle to the Gentiles while the 12 were still in basic training. The disciples had a lot more to learn, but this man had an experience and he shared it. So then we move into what many of the commentators that I read called a Mark sandwich. It's a literary technique. It starts a story, and in the middle of that story, we get another story, and then we go back and finish the first story. So first of all, it's back to the Jews. Jesus gets in the boat, goes back to the west, crosses the sea, and the crowds gather immediately on the lake. Among them is Jairus, who comes to Jesus to plead for the healing of his young daughter. In verse 22 of Mark 5, we read, "Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. 'My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.' And Jesus immediately went with him. He headed out with him." So here comes this man. Jairus was an official in the synagogue. And it shows us that not all the Jewish leaders, not all the rulers of the synagogues were hostile to Jesus. Some were not, and this man certainly was not. Now, he was motivated by the fact that that his daughter was very ill. And there were doctors, there were people who practiced medicine at this time, but they were expensive, and only the wealthy were privy to that kind of help. And Jairus was one of those. He probably had tried doctors and no one had been able to help his daughter. It's interesting that 3 parents plead for their children in the book of Mark, chapters 7 and 9. We'll see 2 more. And all of these are effective pleas. Jesus is compassionate to children, and he wants to get in and help right away. He goes with Jairus immediately. Now, Jairus is prostrating himself before Jesus is an admission of his own inferiority. Here's a Jewish leader of the synagogue bowing down to this man, Jesus. It's a major admission by one in his position that he is powerless and that he is giving himself over to Jesus. And Jairus is asking for the laying on of hands, says he sees Jesus as a healer with maybe divine power, but not a medical doctor. He wouldn't be asking a doctor to lay on hands. He asked Jesus to do that because he thinks that there is power in this man. Interesting. So now the inside story. We started Jairus' story, and then all of a sudden Jesus is caught in a large crowd, and they're pressing against him. And back in Mark 3, verse 9, Jesus told the disciples to have a boat ready to keep the people from crowding against him. And he has a boat here as well, but he chooses not to get in it. He stays with the people. He stays inside. Middle East culture, Eastern culture all supports people standing in close proximity. I've had occasion to be in Hong Kong, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, walked out of the hotel, and I thought Bush Stadium must have just let out. There are just people shoulder to shoulder everywhere, and they're not uncomfortable with that. But there are some rules, very definite rules. You don't reach out and touch anybody. If you bump into them, that's perfectly okay. Jesus is not concerned, we see, with cleanliness. Remember in chapter 1 where he reached out and touched the leper. Again, that was against all societal standards. But he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He later tells Pilate, he says, my kingdom is of another world. And so his concern about the issues of being touched by somebody else, just interesting that he brings it up here because he feels something special. Now, the woman was had a 12-year issue problem. She'd been bleeding for 12 years, and she had suffered a great deal under the care of doctors and spent all she had getting and trying to get better. But instead of getting better, she got worse. And we see that in verse 26. So she pressed forward behind Jesus because she believed, if I can just touch his clothes, I will be healed. That's verse 28. Now, this was considered highly improper. Bumping up against someone wasn't, but reaching out and grabbing them, that was just not appropriate. And she, like the leper, was ostracized and considered unclean because she had this illness and couldn't get rid of it. The fact that she had consulted doctors, and only the elite, I told you, could afford doctors, indicates that she had wealth. Perhaps she was a widow and had used up her money trying to be healed without success. Mark 30:34, Dr. Bowles of Concordia Seminary, who wrote one of our definitive commentaries, calls these engaging verses. Let's listen to them. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and you can ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who'd done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said, daughter, faith has healed you. Go in peace, be freed from suffering. Well, there's a lot packed in those verses, and Dr. Bills is right. The disciples interact with Jesus as if he were a man, any man. Now, they've just been in the boat with him and seen him calm the sea. But when he asks a question about who touched him, they say, why would you ask us a question like that? Don't you see the situation we're in? And they portray Jesus as a man, and Jesus kind of goes along. He keeps up that human response by looking around to see who had touched his clothing. Yet there is no reason to believe that he does not know that the woman had touched him. Jesus seems to know and not know. We see his humanity and his divinity. He seems to have all power under control, and at the same time, his power seems to be slightly outside his control. So it's a very interesting look at Jesus as he shows a human side here, and yet at the same time has at his disposal his power as God. The woman draws near, but does so with fear and trembling, and that's a common response. Remember those people back with the Gentiles? So they came and were afraid, and she was too. So once again, we see that fearfulness arise in God's saving activity. When people see the power of God, it is scary. And there is for her a sort of approach avoidance conflict. She wants to get close to him, explain her situation, throw herself at his mercy, and at the same time, she's afraid and wants to stay away. But then Jesus addresses her as daughter. She is part of the family and no longer ostracized. She's been restored. She is more than healed of her physical ailment. And we're going to look at that later in terms of how Mark uses words like healed in physical. She has had God's reign and rule implemented in her. So something more has happened than just the healing of her illness. So we'll take a look at that. And now the rest of the story. When Jesus was speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, this is verse 35, and they reported that the ill child had died. There's no need to bother Jesus any further. But in verse 36, we find that Jesus ignores these reports and tells Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him to Jairus' home, where they find much commotion carrying on. It's interesting that he takes these three with him. They are the same three he took with him to the Mount of Transfiguration. And in this case, he probably wants the crowd to be small. He doesn't want a lot of promotion about what he's about to do, but he comes into a lot of commotion and wailing. He says, why are all this going on? This child is not dead, but asleep. And the people scoff at him. They say, come on. We know a dead kid when we see one, and this one has died. And he commands the girl to get up, and she does. And he gave strict orders not to broadcast this event. Remember, we're back in Israel. And he says, don't go telling everybody about this. And then he says, let's take care of this person's physical needs. Give her some food. You know, that we know that God provides for us every day, and that we have our physical needs met because of his hand. And it's interesting that as he heals this child, his first concern is for her well-being physically. Now, here's a little bit about that healed, saved stuff. We said earlier, we talked about this in chapter 1, and maybe you've heard of it since. Mark's language is always precise. And the word heal in the original language is a passive voice verb. It means something happens, but there's no action on the part of the person who has either done the healing or who is healed. It's a passive experience. If you've had a sore, you've had something on your a mosquito bite, and it heals quite passively without much action or no action on your part. That's kind of what this is like. But the word saved is an active verb. It means somebody's doing something, some action is taking place. So when Jesus says your faith has healed you, it is always, according to Dr. Vels, and I thought this was just fascinating, in active voice. It denotes, he says, giving salvation in a wider sense, including rescue from sin, death, and the forces of evil, and all that is opposed to the reign of God and the rule of God. So Jesus uses the active voice when he saves. He's welcoming these people not just to be healed, to feel better physically, but to be rescued from sin, death, and the forces of evil, and anything that opposes the reign of God. He brings them into the family. He addresses them as family members. He calls the woman daughter. You are now a member of the family. He did not do that with the Gentile. In fact, he told the Gentile to go back to his family, the family of the Gentiles, and begin the ministry there. So what can we conclude? Chapter 5 sees Jesus' ministry growing and expanding. He's opened the door, a proleptic look at the Gentiles, and he expands his ministry to the Jews. He has more and more people hearing about him, and his gospel is for all. We see that in this chapter. It goes from a crazed demoniac, the Gentiles of the Decapolis, the woman who has long illness and has spent her funds, a ruler of the synagogue, and a little child in her family. A wide range of folks that Jesus is concerned about. And Jesus' power is stronger than Satan's power. It's scary. Experiencing Jesus' power causes great fear. And some reject him when they see his power. Others embrace him with reverence. What is the difference? Well, the difference is faith. It is believing that matters. Believing that trusting matters. That this person, no matter how powerful or scary, cares about me. Faith matters. We will see a new heaven and a new earth where there is no sea, no fear, no danger because of our faith. What a tremendous gift that is. You know, from time to time, it happens to all of us. Someone will say to us, how are you? And it's sort of a ritual. It's always a little concerning when somebody launches into a big expression of how they really are. But we always think of it, I think, as physically. How are you physically? Are you feeling okay? The older I get, the more I think that's true. But it would be interesting, I think, when someone asks you that question, to have that question refer to how you are spiritually. When we sit down at table and we have a meal and we say a prayer, that prayer is in fact a reminder that God is the source, that Jesus is the source of all we get physically, that he takes care of our needs, and that the food that we're about to receive comes from his hand. So when someone says to you, how are you? I would invite you to think that you are fine spiritually, that you are in Jesus' hands, that you can face the great power of Jesus and know he still loves you and cares for you every day. That might be just a nice way for us to reinforce in our own hearts and minds that we are members of his family, that we've been taken in through baptism and become a part of his family. Well, next week, Jesus returns to his hometown. You'd think going back to your hometown after all he's been doing, they'd be putting up banners and welcoming him home. I wonder how that goes. You'll have to wait till next week to find out. Thank you for your attention today, and see you. I'll be back with you in a few weeks, I think, at chapter 9. See you soon.